state of affairs when it comes to young black and brown men and increasingly young brown and black women with regard to the criminal justice system based on what we know about that system. The fact that we know, for example, that 1 in 3 young black boys are likely to end up in prison in the course of their lifetimes is an all too familiar refrain that we've heard. It's in our head. We know, of course, that there are 2.5 million people, give or take, in the criminal justice system formally, either in jail or in prison, right? You've heard this before. I only say it because I want you to be clear what I'm making reference to. But this way of communicating the state of affairs, this starting point for a conversation about whether we're spending too much money on our prison system, which is a different conversation as to whether we're locking up too many people. If it were cheaper to lock up this many people, then we might not be having the conversation at all. But the fact is that lots of people are having the conversation because the criminal justice system is a behemoth. It is expensive. And so people who have no particular moral concern about who's in prison, how many of them are there, how long they've been there, and whether or not their children and grandchildren will end up there too, it's separate and apart from the question of the cost of the system. But the fact remains, because of that crisis of its size, of its costs, lots of people are engaged in a conversation using the statistical language. But what does that mean? How did that happen? If you read an average mainstream press article about the relationship of who's in prison and the size of the prison system, I can guarantee you that many people, right, because I don't have the number, can't tell you what exact percentage it is, right? Many people, that's good enough for me, many people will make the claim that the reason why there are that many people in prison is because there are that many people doing bad things in our society. And the point is that bad people get what they deserve. So that the number for them, the 2.5 million, the 1 in 3 born, is an indication, is a simple shorthand reference point of the moral status of those people. The undeservingness of those individuals for any sympathy or compassion for their plighted society, because they've made a bunch of choices that have produced this prison problem. And it's a damn shame that we have to spend that hard-earned taxpayers' money to punish them this way. That's what you will hear. Now you will hear the left version of this, which is, the left version is that this system is a racist criminal injustice system. It is a prison industrial complex. It is the 4th stage of the racial caste system in America, moving from slavery to Jim Crow to the ghetto to the prison. And they use the same information. Now, I happen to agree with that side of it. But the problem is that that information is insufficient to changing the point of view of the other side. They're trapped, as Du Bois learned 100 years ago when he wrote The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, that you can't win that argument. Why? Well, why? Because the nation's history speaks volumes about what those numbers were intended to do at the very beginning. It's the old problem of tearing down the master's house with the master's tools. In this instance, if you don't know the history of what those statistics were intended to do, why they came into being, then you don't realize that you're fighting a battle with data with one hand tied behind your back. Because the weight of the past will give the benefit of the doubt to the right's view or the opposing viewpoint, or the viewpoint that people in prison are there because of the bad decisions they've made. So let me be more specific. There was no discourse about black criminality prior to, essentially, the end of slavery. You couldn't have a black crime statistic problem in America until black folk were free. Period. Punishment as a philosophical and sociological problem was intended, and as someone who used to teach criminal justice history from the Code of Hammurabi to the Puritans to the 19th century New Nation period, I spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, but punishment essentially was repairing a social contract. Now, back in colonial times, Puritans, or those who practiced religiously based criminal justice practices, would ban actually separate one from the social contract. So banishment was the primary instrument of punishment to sever the social contract. You broke the social contract, you sinned against God, your sin will bring damnation upon our entire religious community, and so the only way to repair that social contract is your banishment and or your repenting, which is essentially the move from banishment to prison. The prison was the basis for restoring the social contract and creating the space for reflection to repent and to repair one's relationship individually with God, which would benefit the whole community. Those are very different uses of punishment back then than they are now. But the problem is that they were predicated on an ethnocentric view of who was part of the community. So as it turns out, the vast majority of people who were banished from the community, disproportionately, I hate to use the word, but I have to make the case, were Black folk and Native Americans in this country. Those subject to a permanent severing from the community. Now that's the colonial period. Once slavery becomes the dominant economic institution in American society, it is the engine of America's growth. It is the reason America is the world's leading superpower. Once slavery comes on the map, there is no need to repair a person who is defined as property to a social contract. So the vast majority of those who were enslaved were not punished in a court of law or punished in a prison or on a work gang because those were rights tied to one's citizenship. It was a privilege to be incarcerated back in slavery times. And one of the interesting footnotes to this is, as free Black populations in places like Virginia and Maryland, and obviously as you move north, but particularly in the border regions, the Upper South, where the free Black population of Virginia in the mid-1800s was so substantial that it created problems of fugitive slave laws. It created instability in society because you had the presence of too many Black folks who thought they were equal to their white counterparts. Well, when the criminal justice system began to pay more attention to them, they realized they couldn't lock them up with white folks. I mean, think about today the assumptions that people who are in prison are there because of the bad things that they do. And this history of, let's just say you have two rightfully convicted people, one white, one Black, and because of white supremacy, you can't even put the Black guy in prison because that is to degrade the white prisoner. Like, that's a history that tells us something about the universe of white supremacist ideas, that even in that category, even in that lowly category of the criminal, that space we reserve for that person who has broken our trust, who is deserving of a form of unfreedom, that white people were still deserving of a form of punishment that reinforced their citizenship that Black people were not. That's some history for you. Because it tells you something about the psychology of the relationship of crime to punishment that's built into the infrastructure of our nation, to the cultural DNA of this country. It also explains quickly, and this is relevant to this point, it also explains quickly why, once you had mass freedom, once you had Black people as citizens, now you have a criminal justice system that has to respond. It doesn't fairly, but due process in court with the 14th Amendment. People had their day in court. They were subject to a process. Again, we all know that it broke down. The machinery of justice was discriminatory, flawed, genocidal, you fill in the blank. But nevertheless, the predicate was that these were citizens of the state and of the nation, deserving of the same treatment. Isn't it, therefore, no surprise that we would see forms of confinement that were beyond the prison walls? One, because it's expensive to lock people up. Southerners knew that as well as anybody. They had no infrastructure for a system of criminal justice that became the primary form of social control for newly freed people. The political economy of the South turned quickly to the criminal justice system as a form of social control, but it came at a cost to that system. You have courts, you have judges, you have due process, you have to away. And so convict leasing was a solution. Leasing the prisoner to a private company solved the problem of the cost of confinement and had the added benefit of producing revenue that could come back to the state and make it actually profitable. So you found a silver bullet, a social panacea, to one, increase the capacity of the state to control a newly freed population using the criminal justice system. You achieve the goal of social control. Two, the cost of punishment and confinement is resolved through the private lease between the state and the contractor. And three, in a society with no industrial infrastructure to catch up with the North that has now set the economic blueprint for the nation, which means you've got to have railroads, you've got to have factories and forms of industry that are embryonic in the South because it had remained a largely agricultural economy. Now you've got extra revenue, and you can actually use that money to build. Now, Douglas Blackman, in Slavery by Another Name, has told this story brilliantly in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, published in 2009, and in a companion documentary that aired on PBS last year, and I think a few cycles this year. So that story is pretty well known to us, and particularly for students of this period, from Reconstruction to the rise of Jim Crow. This is fairly standard stuff, but our kids don't know. I mean, remember, we have to keep that in mind, because I'm not just giving you an academic talk, for us academics to prove how smart we are. Our kids don't know that story. And why wouldn't we tell them that story? Well, I have reasons for why we wouldn't tell them that story to us black folk too. And I'll get to that. But this number, 1890 census, is the very first census that comes out after the end of slavery, that is considered authoritative and reliable, which are very important to social scientists and demographers. They want to make sure the data is clean, and they were very conscious of this in this day and age. It's the first one because the previous two, 70 and 80, were fraught with problems related to the Civil War and its aftermath. And especially on the question of black people and their status, their health or welfare in society, they were problematic because sampling techniques were not considered reliable enough to capture the entire population. What also made the 1890 census particularly useful to demographers of this Jim Crow emerging moment was that in 1890, you could capture a black person who'd never been enslaved, and capture in this sense in the data. If you're born in 1865, you're 25 years old. That's really good data. We have any social scientists in the audience? That's great data. You got a generational cohort, right, that's never been enslaved. And so why does that matter? I'm not going to go down too much of a rabbit hole in this one because I want to keep it moving. But essentially because the debate about abolition and pro-slavery was tied to this notion of what black people were capable of. And so you couldn't tease out who was right. You had to go on faith. The abolitionists had to go on faith that black people were capable of living up to their expectations. And I'm not going to get into what all that means, but essentially they made the case that God made one human race and black people were part of it, and that they were no different than white people. That was the case that they made. Well, it was a case. Guess what? It was unknowable. It could not be proven. And even when they searched for proof of it, the problem they ran into was that how can you separate out the impact of slavery? That some had benefited, which was the pro-slavery argument. We have taken savages from Africa and made them like us. That's because of slavery. If we get rid of slavery, they will turn back to the beasts that they were when we found them in the jungles of Africa. This is their argument. This is the pro-slavery argument, and it is couched in some of the best language you could ever read in mid to late 19th century work. But that's what it amounted to. Well, the abolitionists rejected the claim that black people were corrupted by the influence of the being torn from their native lands, brought to this country, and degraded by slavery. That slavery was a moral debasement of people's souls. But you couldn't prove it. You couldn't prove it. And so the moment where the need to prove things actually coincides perfectly with the end of slavery. Sociology doesn't even exist as a discipline.